Story 1. A few years ago, I stayed at my girlfriend Emma's dad's house for about a month. It was tucked away between a sprawling forest and a quiet river, situated in the rural outskirts of Vermont. Emma's dad, Greg, owned several hundred acres of land, including most of the surrounding woods. One of his favorite features was a narrow, winding trail through the trees, a sort of makeshift path that led nowhere in particular, but I liked walking it to clear my head. It was a particularly foggy afternoon when I decided to head out for a walk. I pulled on my boots and told Emma I'd be back in a bit. She was never fond of hiking through the woods, so I always went alone. As I entered the woods, the fog seemed heavier than I remembered. The mist was so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. I'd never seen it quite like that before, but I wasn't worried. I knew that as long as I stayed on the narrow path, I'd be able to find my way back. As I walked, I noticed something strange. My footsteps seemed to echo back at me, almost like someone else was walking alongside me, mimicking every move. I stopped, straining to hear over the fog, and called out, "Hello." There was no answer and no other footsteps. I assumed it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, so I continued on. The fog rolled through the trees, and the soft crunch of my boots on the leaves and the occasional chirp of distant birds was about all that filled the air. It felt peaceful in a way, calming even. But then I heard it, a low, groaning noise like someone in pain. It sounded like an elderly man struggling to breathe. Alarmed, I walked toward the sound, hoping someone might be in need of help. I called again, "Hello, are you okay?" The sound grew louder, but when I looked up, I saw something ahead, an indistinct figure, barely visible in the fog. It was tall, but shrouded in mist so much that I could only make out its shape, not its details. That had to be the person making the strange noise. I cautiously approached the figure, still calling out to see if they needed assistance. But the closer I got, the more unsettling it became. No matter how much I walked, I wasn't getting any closer. The figure seemed to remain the same distance ahead of me, no matter what. This was when I really started to feel uneasy. I shouted, hoping to get a response, but all the sounds stopped immediately. I took a couple more steps forward and then nothing. The figure remained static in the fog, unmoving. That's when it hit me. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get any closer. I turned on my heels, starting to walk back toward the house. A shiver ran down my spine, but I tried to stay calm. I glanced over my shoulder, and that's when I realized the figure was still behind me. But it wasn't just behind me, it was following me, maintaining the exact same distance, no matter how fast I walked. That's when it clicked. There were no legs. The figure appeared to be floating, its lower half lost in the thick fog. My heart raced, and my breath became shallow as I broke into a run, panicking now. Every time I looked behind me, it was still there, hovering just as far away as it had been from the start. I sprinted through the woods, desperate to escape, until finally I burst out into the yard in front of the house. I slammed the door behind me, gasping for air. Emma, Greg, and her brother, Mark, came rushing to the back door, concerned. I pointed out the back window, still panting. There's someone or something out there in the woods. It's been following me, no matter how fast I ran. Greg grabbed his jacket and stepped outside with me. I pointed to the spot where I last saw the figure. We stood there for a moment, waiting for something to appear, but the fog had cleared and the area was empty. Greg clapped me on the shoulder, shaking his head. "No one's out here, don't worry about it. It's just us, me, you, Mark, and the dogs. We've got everything covered." I tried to laugh, but it came out nervous. I pretended for a second like I wasn't utterly freaked out, but inside I knew I'd never forget that feeling. I wasn't usually one to buy into ghost stories or paranormal experiences, but what happened out there that day definitely made me reconsider. It still sends a chill down my spine whenever I think about it. Story 2. While I was in the middle of relocating from my family's house in Queens to a new apartment in Brooklyn, I was using various apps like OfferUp and Facebook Marketplace to find new furniture. At this point, I had already secured the apartment in Brooklyn, but I was still staying with my family while finishing up the decorating process. One evening, I came across an affordable, stylish dresser that would perfectly complement my new furniture. I reached out to the seller. His name was Adam, and he responded quickly. We agreed on a time and place to meet that evening near his place, which was on a quiet dead-end street by a small park. Adam explained that he worked late, so the only time he was available to meet was after 10 p.m. most days. That worked fine for me since I didn't have work the following day. The meeting was set for 10:30 p.m., but I decided to arrive a bit early. Honestly, the later it got, the more unsettling it felt. I showed up around 10:15 p.m., maybe even a bit sooner. It was a foggy night, and the visibility was so poor that I couldn't even tell if there were other cars around. Just as I parked at the end of the street, I got a message from Adam on OfferUp. "You're early. Give me a second. I'll be right out." I thought, how did he know exactly when I arrived? Was he watching me through the fog? Still, I replied, okay, and started looking around more cautiously. It quickly became apparent that there were no ordinary houses on the street, at least not the kind you'd expect in a residential area. It was a strangely isolated part of Queens, with a couple of small, unidentifiable buildings scattered around. Eventually, Adam sent another message, "Come on around, the dresser, waiting out back." Out back, I couldn't see anything. I stepped out of my car and texted him, asking where exactly to go. That's when the responses stopped and I heard a voice calling, "Over here." I followed Adam's voice through the fog, feeling like I had somehow stepped into a weird horror movie. Every now and then, I would shout back, "I'm coming." I walked down a narrow, alley-like path between two buildings. This didn't feel like a typical street at all. As I made my way through the alley toward what seemed like a backyard, I couldn't tell if the area was large or small due to the thick fog and darkness. It was impossible to see more than a few feet in front of me. At some point, Adam stopped calling out. The area became eerily silent, except for the faint hum of distant traffic. Something didn't sit right with me. I was about to turn around when I heard his voice from ahead. "Wait, the dresser, just inside here. Come inside." I could hear him, but I couldn't see him. I didn't respond. I just started backing up toward the alley again. As I turned around, I saw figures standing just a few feet away from me, eerily still against a wall or fence, barely visible in the fog. A chill ran down my spine. I realized something was seriously off. I started running back the way I came, hearing footsteps behind me. At least 3 people were chasing me. I didn't run for my car because I knew I wouldn't have enough time to start it and maneuver out. Instead, I kept running down the road until I couldn't run any longer, and then I called the police. It wasn't long before 2 patrol cars showed up. I flagged one down and we drove back to the area where the encounter had happened. We checked the small yard, but there was no one there. 2 buildings I'd passed were abandoned storefronts. The back door was wide open, but inside there was nothing at all. "No dresser, of course." I showed the officers the offer-up conversation, and I gave them the account info of the person who posted the ad, hoping it would help with the investigation. But for some reason, nothing ever came of it. I don't think the police did much with the lead. All I know is that if I had gone into that building, something truly awful would have happened. Story 3. Last Sunday, while I'm writing this, it was an unbelievably foggy day. My family and I are stuck in quarantine in Connecticut. My wife was out picking up groceries, and my son was in his room playing video games. I was trying to work on my laptop in my home office when my 7-year-old daughter, Lily, came rushing in, saying she saw someone in the backyard. I stood up and went over to the window to check, and sure enough, there was someone standing in the garden. Their back was to us, and they didn't seem to be doing anything in particular. The fog was so thick, though, that I couldn't even tell if it was a man or a woman. That's how dense it was. I knocked on the window in an attempt to scare them off. I saw the person turn their head and then slowly walk further into the garden until they vanished into the mist. I told Lily to stay inside while I quickly grabbed my shoes and went outside. The person had only wandered deeper onto the property. We live in a big house on several acres of land, so seeing someone in the yard, especially in those conditions, was unsettling. My instinct was to follow where I had seen them go. I started hearing a faint thudding sound, and as I got closer to the tool shed at the back of the yard, I realized the noise was coming from there. As the shed came into view, I saw the person standing by the door, repeatedly slamming it shut. I shouted, "Leave now or I'll call the police." I walked closer and could finally make out the figure. It was a middle-aged woman, looking unkempt. She kept apologizing over and over, saying sorry at least a dozen times before running away at full speed toward the road, disappearing into the fog. Later that night, after my wife and I had finally turned off the TV and tried to sleep, we heard something from outside. It was that same slamming sound from the backyard, and I instantly recognized it. My heart sank when I realized it was the shed door again. My wife was shaking, terrified, and insisted I go outside and deal with whoever it was. I didn't mention the woman to her because I didn't want to scare her further. I threw on my shoes, grabbed a flashlight, turned on every light in the backyard, and went outside, yelling loudly to make my presence known. The slamming stopped immediately. The fog was still heavy. I had to walk a ways before I could even see the shed clearly. When I got there, the door was wide open, but the woman was nowhere in sight. To be honest, I was terrified about going into the pitch-black shed, but I figured I had to do it. As the head of the house, I couldn't just ignore it. I rushed into the shed, shouting to make it sound like I wasn't scared, but it was empty except for me. I slammed the door shut, locked it tightly, and yelled once more about calling the police if anyone came near. Then I went back into the house. I turned off all the lights and started heading toward our bedroom. Just as I reached the hallway, Lily came running up to me, crying. "What happened?" I asked her. She said, "Look outside my window." My stomach dropped. I rushed to her room, keeping the lights off, and saw the woman standing right at the window, trying to open it. I could finally see her face clearly, and it was disturbing. Her skin was saggy and cracked, her hair was wiry and gray, and her teeth were in awful shape. She looked downright dangerous. I screamed at her to get away from our house and grabbed my phone to call 911. As soon as I shouted, the woman bolted, running off into the fog once again. When the police arrived, they couldn't do much besides radio for backup. They assured me they'd keep an eye out, but there wasn't enough evidence to pursue anything further. The next morning, I found the shed door had been left open again. I can't shake the feeling that she's watching us, and I'm genuinely worried that one of these nights, she'll make it inside the house.